theyeshiva.net.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Raichik, for your kind introduction and your very meaningful words. I am thrilled and privileged to be here with all of you, and I want to thank all of the rabbis and the rebbitzins of all the Chabad centers who have brought us here together this evening to explore the tracing impact of the Lubavitcher Rebbe in tribute to his 26th yahrzeit this coming Wednesday night. What an honor and a schus and a merit to be here with each and every one of you, so many dear friends, and hopefully in the future, even those of you who I don't know will be dear friends, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen from all of the communities. I want to particularly give a shout out to the unsung heroes of the Jewish people who day in and day out are dedicated heart and soul, with their mind, with their body, with their nechama, to the welfare of their communities and Jews of all walks of life, really building bridges of love, of understanding, of camaraderie. So I want to give a shout out to all of these Chabad rabbis and rebbitzins, the ambassadors of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, to your communities who have done such a magnificent job in creating Jewish awareness, Jewish revival, in bringing so many Jews together, in building bridges, in making every Jew feel that he or she has a comfortable and dignified place in the unbreakable chain of Jewish continuity and Jewish dynasty, which begins with Sinai and continues till Mashiach. So thank you, Chabad of Silver Springs, Rabbi Berel and Chaya Wolvovsky. Thank you, Chabad of Northern Virginia, Rabbi Sholom and Chani Deitsch, or in my days they called him Shucky. Chabad of Olney, Rabbi Bentzy and Devora Stolik. Harford Chabad, Rabbi Kushi and Fraida Shusterman. Chabad of Upper Montgomery County, we just heard from the illustrious Rabbi Sholom and his wife Chani Raichik. Chabad of Arrundel County, Rabbi Nochum and Hindy Light. Chabad Student Center, University of Maryland, Rabbi Eli and Nechama Backman, whom I actually Zoom has placed him near me in the screen so I get to see him. And those are the names that I have. So welcome and really thank you, not just for this evening, but thank you for your true dedication, day in, day out, pre-corona, amid corona, post-corona. I want to tell you one thing, and I say this in all sincerity. For us rabbis, corona, with all of the tragedies and all of the illnesses and all of the difficulties, has also provided an incredible opportunity to take a little vacation. In the 20 years, I'm married for 21 years. I don't remember, I asked my wife if there was a single Shabbos. She remembers that I stayed home. I didn't give a sermon. I didn't give a speech. This was the first time that all of us were forced to stay home, spend time with our children on Shabbos, no speeches, no sermons. In many ways, it was a pleasure, it was a Chaya. But the Chabad rabbis and rebbitzins during the last months, even from home, worked in many ways harder than ever before. I've spoken to dozens of them, or heard from dozens of them, because they took responsibility for all the lonely people in the community, senior citizens, widows, widowers, broken families, people with economic challenges, people with different health challenges, making sure they have the food they need, the company they need, the care they need, making sure they can do a Passover Seder on their own, celebrate the holiday of Shavuos the way a Jew should celebrate it according to the limitations. And really, they remain my great heroes and unsung heroes of the entire nation of Israel. So I salute them, I applaud them. You make the Rebbe proud, and you and the Rebbe make God proud and give him so much nachas and delight, and you make us all proud that you are in our midst, from strength to strength. So I was asked to address this evening the lasting impact of the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory. It was already William Shakespeare who identified the difference between people who have power and people who have influence. And the two are not the same, even though power and influence are sometimes interchangeable terms. But when you think about the terms, they're absolutely different and sometimes opposite. Power ceases when a person dies, and influence sometimes begins when a person dies, or at least continues and sometimes increases when a person dies. And there are people who during their lifetime have a lot of power, tremendous power. But once they breathe their last, the power ceases, it's transferred to another person. Case in point would be all of the monarchs, mighty emperors and kings in history who, when they were alive, they may have possessed incredible power, including the Jewish kings that you read about in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible. But once they died, as Ecclesiastes says so eloquently, the dead dog, the living dog is far more powerful than the dead lion. A dead Julius Caesar or Caligula or Adrian or Tiberius was just dead, even if in their lifetime they had so much power. There are other people who during their lifetime may have had a little power or may have had almost no power. But what influence they had. And that you see after they pass away, when the influence continues and just continues to grow. A case in point would be the prophets of Israel. The prophets of Israel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, Tzvanya, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, etc., they had very little power. Isaiah was murdered by the king of Judea, Manasseh, his own grandson. Jeremiah was placed into a quicksand for years, imprisoned, confined, tortured. These prophets had no power whatsoever. But what influence? Till today, their visions, their ideals, their passion for social justice inspires humanity till this very day, thousands of years later. Take Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva had no power. He was murdered barbarically by the Romans, the Talmud says in Tractate Brachas. But what influence? What influence Rabbi Akiva has? There's not a Jewish boy or girl, not a yeshiva, not a seminary, not a cheder, Talmud Torah, Jewish day school, Jewish college, Jewish academy that is not saturated with the teachings of Rabbi Akiva. Every boy, every girl, every Jewish student opens up a text of Jewish scholarship and Rabbi Akiva's influence is felt there. Power? I don't know, but what influence? The Lubavitcher Rebbe, I believe, belongs to this unique category. When he was alive, the Rebbe had very little power, but influence. And that influence only increased and continues to increase literally with each year. It's an astounding phenomenon because people who dedicate their life not to building their own career or resume or portfolio or power, as great and as noble that may be, go into one category. But people who dedicate their life to touch a generation, to impact the world, and to inculcate souls and hearts with a vision for the future, with an ability to reframe their lives and see themselves as ambassadors of light, those people, their contribution just continues to increase with each and every year. The Talmud in Baba Basra, page 91, describes the funeral of Abraham. I don't know how many of you know that we have a record of what the funeral of Abraham looks like in the Talmud. The Talmud says that the great people of the generation came to say goodbye to Abraham, because Abraham was not just a phenomenon among his family. He was, as the Hittites tell him in Genesis, Nesi Elokim ata b'seichenu. You're a divine prince among us. And the Talmud says that they eulogized Abraham and they said, woe unto a generation. You know what, I like quoting things exactly. And since this is the advantage This is the advantage of Zoom. You get to do a lecture in your house, so you could see things. I wouldn't be able to do this from the pulpit in the synagogue. So the Talmud says, Baba Basra 91, all the greatest of the nations of the world came to eulogize Abraham, and they stood in a row, and they said, and I quote, Oiloi la'olam sha'avad manhigoi va'oila l'svina sha'avad kabarnita. Woe unto a world which lost its leader. Woe unto a ship which lost its captain. Those were the words of eulogy that they chose to say about Abraham. Now I wish all people who would give eulogies and sermons would learn how to give such a brief sermon. They eulogized Abraham literally in 4 seconds. But sometimes a speech of 4 seconds contains more material and more enriching insight than a speech of 3 hours. I'm speaking also to myself. The art of brevity. What did they mean? Woe unto the world that lost its leader, woe unto the ship that lost its captain. Why these 2 expressions? Because there are 2 types of leadership, my dear friends. There's the leadership of a world which needs a leader, and there's the leadership of a ship that needs a captain. You see, there are those who know how to lead on dry land. There are those who know how to lead in the waters. The experiences are very different. When you're on dry land, the lifestyle and the challenges are of one type. When you're on a boat, especially if the sea is tumultuous and you cannot see the shore, you don't see where your destination is, and there is a lot of fear, and there's just endless water all around and around. I remember once I went on a cruise. We were in the midst of the Atlantic Ocean, and it was the middle of the night, and I went out to the balcony, the deck of my room. There was a big deck, and the fearsomeness, the awesomeness. Of course, you know, as a good Jew who's pessimistic, I reminded myself the images of the Titanic in April 1912. But that's just intergenerational Jewish trauma, which I also carry. But to see the fearsomeness, the awesomeness of the water that just doesn't end. Leadership in a boat, in a ship, is a very different type of leadership than leadership on dry land. It's like leadership in times of peace and leadership in times of war. There have been exceptional leaders for peaceful times, but when they were faced with war, they were absolute disasters. And conversely, there are leaders who at times of conflict are incredibly resourceful. They know how to articulate a vision and imbue their people with the courage and the resolve and the resilience and the fortitude to be able to confront their enemy with dignity, grace, decisiveness, and determination. But when it comes to peace, they simply don't know what to do. Very few leaders could navigate both realities. When it came to Abraham, they said, the world, the dry land where we live, the world that we are inhabitants of, lost its leader. But there's also a ship that lost its captain. And in my mind, the Lubavitcher Rebbe possessed that quality. Because the Rebbe really lived through, in his youth, the most bloody century of human history. Born in 1902 in Ukraine, the Lubavitcher Rebbe grew up in Tsarist Russia, which was saturated with such poisonous venom and hatred to the Jewish people that it's even hard for our generation to understand what hatred on that level means, even though the ugly head, the ugly face of anti-Semitism has reared its grotesque head again. The Rebbe has seen firsthand pogroms, massacres in the early 20th century. Of course, he then experienced the First World War, 1914, which was then called the Great War. And the fact that the Tsar uprooted dozens and hundreds of Jewish communities that were settled for hundreds of years, their infrastructures destroyed because of the accusations that they are helping the Germans in their war against Russia, and it destroyed the Jewish community besides of all the Jewish casualties and so many other casualties. And then in the middle of the war came the Bolshevik Revolution, the revolution that changed Jewish life in Russia for almost a century, uprooting every last vestige of Judaism. The Civil War of 1918, 1920, 1921, and then finally when Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin took hold and the Reds defeated the Whites, the viciousness and the bloodshed and the violence, the savage persecution that the Rebbe observed firsthand in his own family, in his own community, with his father, with his uncles, with his cousins, with his father-in-law, with his teacher, and so many other Jews, was something that obviously I grew up in the home of two parents, my mother, may she be well, and my late father, who grew up in communist Russia. And I always heard from them about the suffering. My own grandfather was almost shot and exiled to Siberia for 25 years. It's indescribable what Russian Jewry endured. And the Rebbe ultimately left Russia in 1927, and he relocated to Berlin. But in 1933, he observed the rise of Adolf Hitler as the Chancellor of Germany, January 33, and the Rebbe fled Germany and went to Paris, and in 1941, witnessed as the Germans invaded France, and the Rebbe and his wife, Rebbe Chaya, fled and ultimately managed to get out of Europe and take the boat and arrive to the United States of America in June 1941. The Rebbe settled in the United States of America in New York, working under the tutelage and mentorship of his father-in-law, who then passed away in the year 1950, only 5 years after the Holocaust, 2 years after Israel. So the Rebbe's first half of his life, he was 48 years old when he ascended to leadership of the Chabad movement, was really a youth that was saturated with so much pain and so much suffering and so much bloodshed and so much violence and so much terrorism. And of course, the greatest black hole of human history and Jewish history, the Holocaust, which wiped out a third of world Jewry, exterminating 6 million of our holy brothers and sisters, including so many members of the Rebbe's personal family, like his brother, his grandmother, uncles, aunts, sister-in-law, brother-in-law, many members of the Rebbe's family who perished either in the Einsatzgruppes massacres in Ukraine and the death camps in Poland. And then, when the Rebbe came to his position as a leader of the Chabad movement in 1950, the Rebbe now had to navigate a very different world. This was the world of democracy, the world of freedom, a world of prosperity, a post-war world where here there were completely new challenges. And that skill of the Rebbe to be able, in the words of the eulogizers of Abraham, to be able to navigate a world, a Jewish world, in a time of war and in a time of peace, in a time of conflict and in a time of prosperity, in a time of crisis lurking at the door and you didn't know, there was absolute uncertainty of what will happen the next morning, to a time when complacency became the new name of the game. This was an incredible visionary skill that God has gifted the Lubavitcher Rebbe to be able to maintain that level of leadership. There is something else. I heard this metaphor from Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, Adin Even Yisrael from Jerusalem. May he have a complete recovery, the famous author of the Steinsaltz Talmud and many other books. And he said, when you're the pilot of an airplane, the plane has its trajectory. It's going in a certain direction. Now, somebody on the airplane may not like where the plane is going. Plane is flying from Washington, say, to Tel Aviv, or to Moscow, or to London. And I'm sitting in the plane, and I don't want to. I was schlepped onto the plane. I'm protesting. So what do? It's like a classic Chelm story. I get up, and I start walking towards the other direction, because I don't like where the plane is going. So I start walking towards the other direction. It's humorous. You know why? Because when the plane lands, you're also going to be in Tel Aviv or in Moscow or in London or in Melbourne. The only difference is, instead of sitting in the first class, you'll be sitting in the back, in the economy class. So the fact that you stood up and you protested the destiny of the pilot is fine. But ultimately, you too are being taken along by the journey. And this metaphor, I think, is very apropos about the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The Rebbe had that unique skill to be able to serve as a pilot of an airplane. The Jewish people, in a post-Holocaust era, were shattered by confusion, by uncertainty, by pain, by turmoil, by agony, by suffering. The future trajectory of the Jewish people was completely uncertain, especially when it came to the spiritual and religious identity of the Jewish people. And if David Ben-Gurion and Chaim Weizmann, etc., went to rebuild a Jewish state, the Lubavitcher Rebbe was determined to rebuild the Jewish soul and to rebuild Jewish dignity and to rebuild Jewish identity and to rebuild Jewish pride and to rebuild Jewish consciousness, understanding that if Jews will be able to be proud in the Jewish state, they will ultimately need a very strong Jewish identity. As we see today, unfortunately, how many Jews whose fathers or teachers were such powerful advocates for Israel are now in the camp of the apologetic ones who have to apologize for our existence in Israel as though we are criminals and running an apartheid state, because the Rebbe understood that if you don't have your feet grounded deeply in Jewish tradition and identity, ultimately the pressures of different circles will get and infiltrate into the Jewish youth and make them question even their relationship to Israel. So the Rebbe, taking a nation that was so broken, really became a pilot. It's not something he liked. I remember I watched the Rebbe personally for many years. I grew up in the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn. It's hard for people to believe this, but the Lubavitcher Rebbe himself was really not the type of, he was very not extroverted. He was an extremely introverted person, very private, very internalized, very not out there. Even before he became a Rebbe, the Rebbe was not the social type. He was always kind and menschlich and gave people dignity and very sensitive and generous. But the Rebbe personally was a person who would not speak a lot. He was not your social person. He was very, very private, extremely private. He kept to himself. And as he once wrote in a letter to his father-in-law, he said, I am a very internalized person and I don't have much to write about because most of my life happens inside of me, not outside of me. He once wrote to the Rabbi of Bnei Brak in 1949, he wrote a letter and he said, you have a talent for public activism. I don't. This was 1 year before he became a Rebbe. Now, for somebody who didn't have a talent in public activism, the Rebbe did not bad for himself. But that's exactly my point. This was a choice he made. This was not nature. Naturally, the Rebbe would have, he had a degree in engineering. Maybe he wanted to be an engineer. He worked in the Brooklyn Navy Yard during the Second World War. The Rebbe was a brilliant, brilliant scholar. He lived privately, alone, together with his wife. Unfortunately, they never had children. The Rebbe learned and learned and learned day and night, served God with every fiber of his being, and did things clandestinely. He never really had the nature, the proclivity to become a public figure. I still recall in my youth watching the Lubavitcher Rebbe walk home on Shabbos. Friday night, the Rebbe would stay in shul very late, and he would go home. By the time the Rebbe would go home, winter, summer, the synagogue was empty. The prayers finished, and everybody went home. People would sit around and shmuas or learn, but then it was empty. My luck, my father, my late father, was Mr. Conversationalist. His name was YY Jacobson, and he was a journalist. So what he did for a living was he had conversations with people. So he would stick around in shul, to my dismay, because I was starving, stick around in shul for hours. He would talk to people and shmuas. He loved shmoozing with people. But as a child, it gave me a rare privilege. And the privilege was the Lubavitcher Rebbe would also stay in shul for hours in his own office. After davening, he would stay in his office and learn. And then he would go home. And by the time the Rebbe went home, there was almost nobody there. So many, many times I had the privilege of walking the Rebbe home. I don't mean walking together with him. I wouldn't walk with him. But behind the Rebbe, walking home. And it was amazing, the simplicity with which he carried himself. The Rebbe greeted every African-American, man, woman, child, every white, every Jew, every person in the street. He greeted them politely, with gentleness, with dignity, with sensitivity, with love. But the way he carried himself, he walked like a very simple, introverted person, just in a very dignified way. He lacked that whole fanfare, the drama. The Rebbe was not like that. He didn't like fanfare, he didn't like drama. For many years, he was upset when they took pictures of him. You know, when I see the Rebbe's pictures all over the place, I smile and I think to myself, it's a little tragic because the Rebbe really loathed this. He really didn't want it. Maybe that's why there's more pictures of him than anybody else, because he really didn't want it. So naturally, you have to understand that for the Rebbe, this was a choice, and a choice that ran contrary to his nature. I want you to understand the sacrifice it took of him a year after the passing of his father-in-law to become the 7th Lubavitcher Rebbe. But once he realized this is his mission, and this is what God wants for him, there was no turning back. And when the Rebbe got onto that plane and went into the pilot's cockpit and he sat down and he began moving that plane towards its destination, which for the Rebbe there was one destination. From Sinai, we're heading towards redemption. Even if the journey is very turbulent, and even if sometimes the plane drops and the plane goes through difficult moments and it goes through fluctuations and vicissitudes, and there are challenging moments, and some people are nauseous on the airplane, and some people are complaining, and they don't like breakfast, they don't like lunch, they don't like dinner, but the plane is on a journey, it's on a mission. And here was the key. Even those who are walking backwards are still part of that journey. And I think in many ways this was the greatness of the Rebbe. The Rebbe defined the mission of a generation, and every person was affected positively by it. It's not a secret that the Rebbe had opponents during his life. People who disagreed with him, people who ridiculed him, people who were cynical, people who mocked him. There was opposition. But even they could not help but being defined, transformed, and affected by the Rebbe's leadership. Because they were on the plane, on the airplane. You may be going in the opposite direction, but the airplane is heading somewhere. This was the unique, powerful humility and dedication of the Rebbe, that he articulated a vision for the generation that ultimately defined the entire Jewish world. Those who call themselves Chabad, and many of those who completely are not associated with Chabad in any way, were also deeply and positively affected by the journey, by the Weltanschauung, and by the leadership of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And here again, I make a comparison to Abraham. If somebody asks you, who was Abraham? What was Abraham's contribution? Most people will say, Abraham is the first monotheist. But that's not the case. Abraham was not the first monotheist. You can read the Bible or read the Midrash. Many people prior to Abraham believed in one God. You had people like Mesushelach. You had people like Chanoich. You had, of course, a person like Noach. You had a yeshiva. There were two men, Shem and Aver. Both lived before Abraham. Progenitors of Abraham. He was a descendant. Shem had a yeshiva. He had an academy of spiritual Torah. Aver also had a yeshiva. Jacob went 14 years to learn in this yeshiva of Shem and Aver. These were people who didn't only believe in God, they preached it, they pontificated it, they taught it, they believed it. Abraham is not the one who discovered monotheism. So what was the uniqueness of Abraham? What made Abraham the first Jew? The answer is as follows. Till Abraham, there were those who believed in monotheism, but they were all in hideouts. They had their little shtiblach, their little basements, and they would have little malava malkas, some herring, some sponge cake. You would sing some songs. In dark cellars and basements, they believed in God and they taught the secrets of monotheism to a few select students who were ready to fight for the truth. You know what the uniqueness of Abraham was? As the Bible says, Vayikra Sham b'Shem Hashem Keil Olam Al Tikra Vayikra Ela Vayakri, as the Talmud says in Saita. Abraham went out to the world. Abraham took monotheism and he turned it outwards. Maimonides writes that Abraham used to go from city to city, from kingdom to kingdom, from tribe to tribe, mimamlacha lemamlacha, from empire to empire. He would lecture, he would teach, he would persuade, he would explain, he would enlighten, he would sing, he would fabring, he would philosophize, he would theologize, he would share with people from all walks of life the truth that our world was conceived in love, that the world is unified, that we're all one, that we all come from one source, that there is oneness that pervades the whole universe, that there is a moral law behind the world, that there is a God who expects from us something. He wants us to be kind to each other, to be decent to each other, to be compassionate to each other. Abraham was the one who had the confidence that monotheism can be brought out to the street and to the world and will impact civilization. Abraham had that inner fortitude and inner faith. You don't have to hide in a little shtibel in a little basement and preach your faith. No, this is what the world wants. This is what the world craves for. This is what the world yearns. This will ultimately become the most powerful message. This is the uniqueness of Abraham. This is what makes him the first Jew. In my mind, this seems very apropos when thinking about the legacy and the impact of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The Lubavitcher Rebbe was not the only American Jew who was committed to Torah and committed to Judaism and committed to Jewish continuity and committed to Jewish faith and passionate about Jewish tradition and Jewish practice. There were many greats, giants, people of scholarship, people with great souls, great hearts, great piety. They had their synagogues, they had their schools, they had their centers, they had their infrastructure, and each of them made a lasting and extraordinary contribution to the Jewish community in the United States or other communities around the world, Israel, Europe, Asia, Africa, etc., through their disciples and their students and their communities, which lives on today as well. The uniqueness of the Rebbe, in my mind, was you could compare him to an Abraham. The Rebbe was the one who understood, as early as the late 1940s and early 1950s, that Judaism does not have to be and should not be on the defensive anymore. We have the ability to turn Judaism outward and go out to the street and ultimately reach out to hundreds of thousands and millions of Jews who consider themselves unaffiliated or assimilated. Jews who their very arrival to the United States of America had them caught up and swept up by the secular embrace of the culture of the United States. And it seemed like, if anything, the Jewish religion is becoming more and more defensive, more and more quarantined, more and more isolated. There was a fellow, he was a doctor. He lived on Eastern Parkway. I heard this from a son of his. He lived on Eastern Parkway. If you know the geography of Brooklyn, he lived, well, today it's important to know the geography of Brooklyn if you're following the routes of the riots and the fireworks every night in Brooklyn. So this doctor lived on Eastern Parkway, on the same street where the Rebbe prayed, 770 Eastern Parkway. And in the early 50s, this doctor turned to his son, a secular Jew, and he pointed to the Chabad Chassidim in the early 1950s. And he told his son, look at them. This is an endangered species. In another generation, they will be gone. They will be obsolete. You will tell your children that these Jews once existed. And this son said this over years later, of course, realizing the error that his father made. I once read an article in a magazine called New York Magazine, not to confuse with New Yorker, New York Magazine. And New York Magazine, this was an article, I believe, from 1954, that time. I saw it many years ago. I'm not from 1954, but I saw the article from 1954 many years later, a copy of this article. And New York Magazine predicted and said that in 50 years from now, this is 53, so 63, 73, 83, 93, 2003, in 50 years from now, Jewish religion will be dead. Jewish culture, Yiddish culture will be alive. Yiddish culture meant things like Yiddish theater, bagel and lox, bingo, Yiddish language, Yiddish literature, Yiddish plays. You had the workmen's circles, Yiddish schools from the Bundisten, the socialists. That will survive, Yiddish culture. You know, Sholom Aleichem and Mendel Amoiches Svarim and the Dibuk, for those of you who remember a little old Yiddish culture from your grandmother's days. Afin Pripitschik brennt a Feierl und in Stub is heiß und der Rebbe mit die kleine Kinder lach lernen Aleph Beis. So he said Yiddish culture and music and theater will survive. But Judaism as a religion, as a way of life, dead, gone. Now it's sad. 50 years later, Yiddish culture is almost gone. Who knows Yiddish today? Me and another few Hasidim in Williamsburg and Borough Park and Jerusalem and Bnei Brak know Yiddish. But Judaism as a lifestyle, as a religion, is thriving. It's thriving amazingly well. The Rebbe had that foresight and, more importantly, that confidence to be able to instill and inculcate in a generation just like the Abraham of old. You don't have to be ashamed. You don't have to be embarrassed. Don't be ashamed to go out with your yarmulke. Don't be ashamed to wear tzitzis. Don't be ashamed to light a public menorah for Hanukkah. Don't be ashamed to go out with a mitzvah tank and play Jewish music in the street and wrap a Jew tefillin on the street, or give him or her a lulav to shake on sukkahs, or Shabbat candles to light. Don't be afraid to go to college campuses, to communities all over, to reach to the heart and mind of the secular Jew and teach him or her the timeless and eternal values of Yiddishkeit, because he taught, never underestimate two things: the truth of Judaism that is timeless and eternal, and the power of a Jewish soul, which is timeless and eternal. And when you have this magical combination, you will be able to succeed. And the Rebbe did not believe in obstacles. I think it was General Montgomery who said, the difficult we do immediately, the impossible takes a little longer. My late father shared with me that Rosh Hashanah 1956. Those of you who know the geography of Brooklyn, you know Rosh Hashanah, we have a custom to do tashlich. In the afternoon, after mincha, we go to a pond of water or a sea, a lake, a river, where there are fish, and we do the special prayers of tashlich, in which we symbolically cast our sins into the water. Now, where the Rebbe prayed at 770, there's no pond. This is, Crown Heights section of Brooklyn. No ponds and lakes and rivers. It's not the type of area. So they would walk to the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens. I don't know, what is it, a 20-minute walk, a 30-minute walk? It's a beautiful walk down Eastern Parkway. You go to the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens, and there was a beautiful pond that still exists with many fish. And each Rosh Hashanah, there was this parade of Hasidim who would march. They would sing songs, Rosh Hashanah in the afternoon. And remember that the whole Eastern Parkway then was filled with Jews. This is before the mass migration from the Crown Heights areas and Bronzeville and other neighborhoods. So there were hundreds of thousands. My mother told me Shabbos, holidays, you had tens of thousands of Jews on the islands of Eastern Parkway. Anyway, 1956 Rosh Hashanah, it was raining, but not just raining. It was pouring, one of those floods where if you go out for more than 2.5 seconds, you come back drenched as though you have been in a pool for a few days. But for the Rebbe, these obstacles were not meaningful enough to obstruct what has to be done on Rosh Hashanah. So he led the parade in the pouring rain to the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens. By the time they got there, everybody was not just soaked, but drenched. But here's the issue. The man who was overseeing the garden and allowing for admission, when he saw the downpour, he understood nobody in their right mind is going to show up today anymore to come to the outdoor gardens in such a weather. So what did he do? He decided, it's time for a break, right? Good excuse for vacation. He closed the gate, he locked the gate, and he went home early. Good for him. There's only one thing he didn't take into account, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So he went home. The Rebbe comes to the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens, and the gates are locked, and they're tall gates. Now, the Rebbe at that time became a Rebbe in 48, so the Rebbe was around, 55, 56. He wasn't an 18-year-old boy. Without skipping a heart's beat, my father told me he was there. Without skipping a heart's beat, the Rebbe gave his prayer book to somebody to hold and started to climb. On Rosh Hashanah, the Rebbe started to climb the gate. Got to the top, went over to the other side, went down, and then turned to everybody and said, "Come, go." And who would not go? The young went, and the old went. Those who needed assistance got assistance. Everybody made it to the other side. They said the prayers, and they went back to shul. For the Rebbe, this was not just a cute little practice and custom to do, to be able to get the Hasidim to be courageous. But this really became the hallmark of leadership. And that is, obstacles are only defined as obstacles if you define them as such. But if you define them as in a different fashion, they become different. Maybe they're only challenges. And every challenge is perhaps only an opportunity to flex your muscles, an opportunity to demonstrate courage, an opportunity to overcome your skeletons and demons, an opportunity to grow deeper and stronger and more authentic, an opportunity for more awareness, an opportunity for tremendous growth. The Rebbe taught all of his disciples, you will encounter gates and fences. Sometimes those fences will be closed and locked, and it will not be easy to get in. But never believe that this means that you have to surrender to despair. You have to have that courage to be able to forge along, knowing where your destination is, knowing that victory is never a question. It's never a question if. It's only a question how. With this, the Rebbe set an agenda for a generation. And here the miracle happened. People from all communities, all walks of life, from Chabad, but much more from outside of Chabad. Jews or Orthodox, Jews from other denominations, ultra-Orthodox, Hasidic, what you call the Litvische world, the Yeshivische world, the Hasidische world, the modern Orthodox world, the very modern Orthodox world, the left, Jews who are more right-wing, left-wing. In their hearts of hearts, they observed Abraham spreading Judaism. And you know what? The youth is taking to it. He's right. There's nothing to be embarrassed. And you know what happened? It emboldened a whole generation of Jews to think big, to think expansively, to create huge buildings, huge communities, huge infrastructures, to create campuses, to be able to look at their future in a different fashion, not to live anymore in the trauma of the Holocaust persecutions and the trauma of 2,000 years of exile, but to be able to think in an emancipated way, to think in an expansive way, to realize that the story of the Jewish people has not ended. On the contrary, it must grow more and more in our march from Sinai all the way towards redemption, all the way towards Mashiach. And you know, my dearest friends, as that pilot moved that plane along, ultimately, everybody was affected in a positive way. The language and the vocabulary of the Jewish world today, in many ways, reflects the innovation, the love, the leadership, and the vision of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The Rebbe was that type of leader. He not only inspired people, he not only taught people, he not only inspired communities and the construction of great institutions and great enterprises and great projects, social, educational, religious, individually, collectively, inspiring and empowering a generation. That too. But the Rebbe had that unique ability to be able to alter the vocabulary of a nation. And to alter the vocabulary of a nation is not simple, because our vocabulary are the modalities in which we think. They represent the phraseology, the philosophical and theological undertones, undercurrents, the paradigms, the premises upon which our lives are based. Our vocabulary is not usually questioned because this is how we live. Challenging your vocabulary means challenging your mindset, challenging your perspective. We all live in a certain vocabulary, and I don't mean here vocabulary literally, what type of vocabulary I use in my speeches, if it's a rich vocabulary, if it's a poor vocabulary, if it's a good vocabulary, if it's a lousy vocabulary. I'm talking vocabulary here as the ways, the messages, the phraseology in which we think, the modalities we have in our neural pathways of how we define reality and how we react to reality. Few are the people who can go into the back end of our computer program, who don't deal with the software but with the hardware, and even more with the chip, not just with the external elements of the body, but with the DNA of the body, to be able to reveal what lay there, all the potential there. That was one of the great skills of the Rebbe. He gave the Jews new words in our vocabulary, and these words eternally were added to the dictionary of Jewish thought and to the dictionary of Jewish life. And I want to address in the remaining of my lecture tonight a few of those special words that I believe the Lubavitcher Rebbe added to the vocabulary of the Jewish people and to the vocabulary of Jewish life. The first word that the Rebbe added to our vocabulary is absolute and unequivocal Jewish unity and responsibility for each other. I always was fascinated. The Rebbe, before every holiday, would send out a message, a letter. And you know who he addressed the letter to? He addressed the letter, Elach kol achenu b'nei u'b'nois Yisrael b'chol makom shehem Hashem aleim yichyu. To our brothers, the sons and daughters of Israel, wherever they live. The Rebbe articulated a message and he addressed it to every single Jew alive. It was reminiscent of Moses. Moses, who speaks to every Jew. Atem nitzavim hayom kulchem lefnei Hashem Elokeichem. I speak to every one of you. Vayakol Moshe kol adas b'nei Yisrael. Moshe gathers every single Jew, man, woman, and child, realizing we are all one family. We are all one collective. The late secretary of the Rebbe, he just passed away right before Passover, day before Passover, Rabbi Leibel Groner, told me that Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner, the legendary, famed Rosh Yeshiva of the Yeshiva Rabbeinu Chaya Berlin, the Yeshiva's Rabbeinu Chaya Berlin today, it's in Flatbush. Its dean, its Rosh Yeshiva was the legendary great Rav Yitzchak Hutner, Zatzal, the Pachad Yitzchak. And Rabbi Groner told me Rav Hutner once came to see the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He asked Rabbi Groner to make an appointment for him. He was considered in the Lithuanian world. He was a student of Slabotka. He was in Berlin. He was a student of Rav Kook. He was one of the great scholars and minds in the Lithuanian yeshiva world. He passed away in 1980. So Rabbi Groner told me personally, I went to see him, I think, he was sitting Shiva for his sister, Rebbe in Baumgarten. And he shared with me, Rabbi Hutner made an appointment. He wants to see the Rebbe. So Rabbi Groner knew Rav Hutner was a very distinguished person and the Rebbe was close to him. So he made an appointment and he told me he was there for a half an hour. When Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner came out, he tells Rabbi Groner wanted to know what happened. He didn't tell him what happened, but he said, I'll tell you why I came. I came because I was very disturbed that the Rebbe addresses his letters to every single Jew alive. How can you address your letter to every single Jew alive? I asked Rabbi Groner, what did the Rebbe answer? He says, I don't know what he answered, but I know why. He came in, he was there for a half an hour challenging the Rebbe on this title. But it was a fascinating thing. And I believe part of it was that the Rebbe really felt that our vocabulary must change. Don't look at yourself as an isolated person and worry only about your own community or your own family. Every single Jew is responsible and is connected to every other Jew in the entire world and ultimately to every human being in the entire world. The Rebbe saw every Jew as his constituency. He took responsibility for every Jew and every Jewish community in the world. Now that's a recipe for restlessness. I know the rabbis and communities know even if you have 300 members in your community, you don't have a day of peace. I know present company excluded, you treat your rabbis magnificently. Maryland is known for that. Maryland and Virginia. But listen, even if you have 300 people in your synagogue, it's not easy. Everyone has a headache and everyone has an issue and this one doesn't like what happened then and this one doesn't like what happened then. But when you have every Jew as your constituency, if there was no mikveh in Kabul in Afghanistan, the Rebbe saw it as his responsibility. And if there was no sheikhet, ritual slaughter in India, the Rebbe felt responsible. And if there was a Jew in Perth, Australia, who needed matzah for Passover, the Rebbe felt responsible. This was an incredible conviction that the Rebbe imbued into the Jewish world. He gave us the vocabulary of mutual love, unity, and responsibility. Never again, the Rebbe taught, shall we repeat the words of Cain, am I my brother's keeper? Hashomer achi anaychi. Am I responsible for what's happening with my brother? I got my own life to worry about. What do I have to worry about my brother? For the Rebbe, the motto of life had to be the words of Joseph, Es achai anoichi bevakesh. I must search for my brothers. Yes, you are my brother. You do take responsibility for your brother. You do take responsibility for your sister. Not because you're codependent. Codependence is not a good thing. You can discuss it with your therapist. But because we're interdependent. Because we're one nation. Kol Yisrael arevim zebazeh. All Jews are guarantors for each other, the Talmud says. And the Rebbe would quote the Baal Shem Tov, arevim means guarantors. Arevim also means mixed. And arevim also means sweet. We are guarantors for each other because we're mixed with each other. We're integrated with each other. Because for each Jew, another Jew is Orev, is sweet. For the memory and the vision and the sight of another Jew, the Rebbe taught, must trigger your inner sweetness. I want to tell you a little story that in my mind captures this vocabulary, this type of attitude, this type of perspective. I read this story written by a man named Rabbi Moshe Grillik. He is the editor of a magazine called Mishpacha in Israel. And for many years, he was the editor of a newspaper called Yated Ne'eman in Bnei Brak. And I have to tell you, this was not a newspaper that was fond of Chabad. And that's why I find his story to be objective and reliable. You can't say this is, some exaggeration of a Chabad fan. Some stories you got to believe because they were written from somebody who was the editor of a newspaper that was, to put it mildly, not very fond of the Chabad movement in the 1980s when it was founded. And Rabbi Moshe Grillik wrote this story and I share it with you. And it's such a moving story, how to think about your Jewish people. And he said he was in Brazil for a while. And in Brazil, there were 2 Jewish schools. And this is today, Brazil, Chana and Harford built itself up beautifully. There's so many schools and social Jewish institutions and synagogues. Jewish life is very vibrant in Brazil. I had the privilege of being there many times, lecturing in many communities in Brazil. But in the earlier years, Brazil was struggling, as so many other communities, with its Jewish identity and Jewish. But they had 2 schools. They had 2 Jewish day schools, and each one was small enough to struggle financially. And they decided, the boards met, and they decided, you know what? Despite our differences and different approaches, it does not make sense to have 2 schools. Just the finances and the overhead are incredibly depleting of the Jewish, they're depleting the funds of the Jewish community. Let's merge the schools. Now, one of the schools had a principal who was a Chabad chassid, an ambassador of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, a student of the Rebbe. And they wanted him to be the principal of this merger because he is recognized as a great pedagogue and educator. And he said, listen, I am a disciple of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, I have to consult him. So he sends a letter off to New York and he tells the Rebbe about the issue. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe advises him and says, I don't think that the 2 schools should merge. They must remain separate. It's not a good idea for them to merge. So this principal went back to his superiors and he said, I'm so sorry, but the Lubavitcher Rebbe told me that he doesn't think the merger is a good idea, so I can't be part of this merger. And if you want to fire me, I understand. But they loved this principal so much, they did not want to let him go because he was really the energy of the school. They knew to let him go, it's going to destroy the school. So begrudgingly, they kept that school open and the 2 schools remained open. But they were so upset with the advice that the Rebbe gave this man, like, why torture 2 schools and have them literally have to support 2 separate schools? I don't have to tell you what 2 separate schools are when you could merge them together and cut the expenses by who knows, by how much percent. A year later, he came to New York and he went into the Rebbe. And he was very uncomfortable. And he turned to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And with respect and sincerity, he said, may I ask a question? The Rebbe said, sure. He said, you wrote to me last year that the schools should not merge. So I told this to them, and they did not merge. But they were so upset. In fact, they were furious. What can I tell them? And the Rebbe looked at him and he said, why didn't you? You should have asked me for the reason. I would have explained to you. This was not rocket science. I had a very simple reason. I could have explained it to them. You didn't have to communicate it to them as a irrational edict. But listen, he was a chassid, and the Rebbe told him the school shouldn't merge, so he just did it. He didn't have to ask the Rebbe for reasons. The Rebbe said, you should have asked me. I would have explained to them my position. Let me explain to you what I was thinking. And here is what the Rebbe told this principal. He said, I want to share something with you. Jewish mothers complain about Jewish schools. That's how it is. The teacher is not good. Principal is not good. Substitute is not good. The other kids in the class are not good. The curriculum is not good. The way they teach the curriculum is not good. The tests are not good. The exams are not good. The sports is not good. Extracurricular activity is not good. The campus is not good. The gym is not good. The food is not nutritious. The food is too nutritious. Too much food. Too little food. I don't like the friends. People complain about schools, and sometimes very good and decent and just complaints. So the Rebbe said, let's take a community like Brazil. There's a boy in one of the schools, and mommy is discontent, or tati is discontent. She goes to the principal and she says, I don't like the class. So what does the principal do? The principal says, I'm sorry, let me try to fix this, fix that. No, it's not working. I'm sorry, I don't know what to do. What can I do? So the Rebbe said, what does the mother do? She'll take the boy or the girl out of school and she'll put him into the other Jewish school. But what happens if there's no other Jewish school? She'll take him out of the school and put him in a public school. And the boy and the girl will be deprived from a Jewish education, because the Brazilian Jewish community is not such a powerful community that if the parent doesn't like the school, they will keep their child there anyway, or homeschool this child to make sure he or she gets a Jewish education. They want a Jewish school, but the Jewish school is not good. They go to a non-Jewish school. He says a community like Brazil must have 2 Jewish schools so that the frustrated parents who have just or unjust complaints against the school can have a second Jewish school where their children will go to, and those children will not be lost forever to the Jewish people. That's why I said the 2 schools can't merge. The principal said he came home. He shared this with the boards of directors of both schools. They said, that is how a Jewish leader thinks. That's how a Jewish leader thinks. What does it have to do? How is the Rebbe going to benefit of some kid in Brazil who's not a Chabadnik, going to a school, not going to a school, going to a public school? But a leader, the Rebbe's vocabulary was one. Don't say, am I my brother's keeper? I love my brother. I care for my brother. I want to be there for my brother. I knew a Jew. He led a Jewish day school in New Haven, a Chetmim in New Haven. His name was Rabbi Moshe Yitzchak Hecht. Morris Hecht. Morris Hecht passed away 1992. And Rabbi Moshe Hecht was traveling to Israel. And this was not frequent for him that he should get away, but he was going to Israel with his wife. I heard this story from his wife and his daughter. And he told the Rebbe that he's going to Israel. And the Rebbe said to him, Rabbi Hecht, I need to ask you a favor. Can you make the ticket, rearrange the ticket so that it should fly through Hungary? And the Rebbe said there's a city in Hungary, in Budapest, I think it was, where there is a home for senior citizens. And there are a few Jewish senior citizens in that old age home. And because of financial reasons, they stopped serving kosher in that home for senior citizens. And I need you, please go there and speak to the supervisors of that senior citizen home and explain to them that it's so important and vital for these people in an old age home to be able to still hold on to that which they hold so dear, which is kosher food. Rabbi Hecht's daughter tells me, my father joked around and he says, the worst idea was to tell the Rebbe that I'm going to Israel. Suddenly, the whole trip was rearranged. He went to Hungary and he did this. But this was the Rebbe's vocabulary. The Rebbe's vocabulary was, we are one. We must not agree with each other. Be able to be here for each other, trust each other, support each other, love each other. Let me give you another word that was added to our vocabulary by the Lubavitcher Rebbe. I think I'm going to do another two words that were added to our vocabulary by the Rebbe, and then we will open the floor to questions. The second word that was added to our vocabulary by the Lubavitcher Rebbe comes in a Hebrew phrase, but of course I'm going to translate it. And that is how you have to look at yourself and how you have to look at another human being. The Rebbe's common phrase to describe another Jew was, He or she is a chelek Eloika mima'al mamash. He or she is a piece of God, a fragment of heaven, a ray of infinity. Sounds very mystical, but for the Rebbe it was anything but mystical. It was real and concrete. As he once said, chelek Eloika mima'al mamash means, mamash, that when you touch, mamash means touching. When you touch a person, you should know that you're touching a piece of God. And for the Rebbe, what that meant was never, ever look at yourself in the mirror or at another person and see only negativity, darkness, trauma, skeletons, demons, ghosts, toxicity, problems, depression, personality disorder, mental illness, and all other types of struggles. Not because they don't exist. The Rebbe was not a naive person. He knew very, very well about trauma. He knew about personality disorder. He knew of mental illness quite well. The Rebbe knew of all types of challenges that plague the human condition, from abuse to loss, from financial struggles to psychological struggles, social struggles, academic struggles, and of course, physical struggles. He knew about grievance, he knew about pain, and he knew about the uncertainty, the insecurity, and all of the psychological challenges that can plague us in a very profound way. But the Rebbe genuinely felt that the prevailing word in our vocabulary, when we describe ourselves or our children or our spouses or our loved ones or our friends or our stranger, has to be able to be you and I are a chelek Eloika mima'al mamash. When you look at yourself, you have to be able to see that you are a piece of God, a ray of infinity, a fragment of eternity, and thus, at your core, you're indestructible. At your core, you're invincible. At your core, you have all of the beauty, all of the joy, all of the happiness, all of the optimism, all of the confidence, all of the resources, and all of the inner joy and happiness that a human being deserves, even if life has disappointed you, and even if you have endured various traumas, and even if you're struggling to this very day. Remember that at your core, you remain invincible, indestructible, because you're divine. Can anybody destroy God? If nobody can destroy God, if nobody can obliterate God, if nobody can crush God, if nobody can stifle God, if nobody can turn God into a traumatized victim or into a hopeless addict, nobody can do it to your core, which is a piece of God. That piece of God remains addiction-free, anxiety-free, stress-free, ego-free, insecurity-free. I know I'm making up words, but that's fine. You get the point. Your core of divinity remains liberated, emancipated, open. The question is, how do I get there? The Rebbe said, believe in it, and you will access it. Breathe it, and you will find it. Know that it's there and live by it, and you will be transported by its powers. But it's often about the mind, because very often my mind is in shackles, and my mind does not allow me to see a self that is beyond anxiety. But for the Rebbe, this was key, that your core self is a chelek Eloika mima'al. It's divine. This became his vocabulary, how you talk about a Jew. It's the well-known paradigm that vibrates through every single Chabad house, from New Zealand to the Congo, from Peru to Anchorage, from Los Angeles to New York, from Silver Springs to Northern Virginia, everywhere on the map, from Moscow to Biribidjan, from Jerusalem to Eilat, from South Africa to Singapore, from Bangkok to London. What's the hallmark of every Chabad house? Non-judgmentalism. When a Jewish man, woman, or child walks into the door, what do I see? I don't look at a person and say, you don't belong, you're tarnished, you're full of sins, you're going to get punished, God hates you, you're a lost case, I don't like you, I don't want to have to do with you. The Rebbe changed that vocabulary. Not because people don't make mistakes and not because people don't have to mend their ways, but because the question is, what do I focus on? What do I see? When I look at my brother or sister coming in through the door, I see a brother, a sister, I see a child of God. I see somebody who is a reflection of God in this world. I see somebody who is a manifestation of divine energy and light in this world. That's what I see. And from that approach, with that approach, I can come and help them mend and repair and transform and fix and mend. I'm not ignoring the flaws or the darkness or the skeletons, but I have as a reference point, as the vortex, there's an essential intrinsic pintalayid, something that's pure. And you know what? Sometimes it's easy to do with other people, but it's so hard to do with me, with myself, with yourself. Some of us have such a hard time to do this with our own children, with our own loved ones. Sometimes it's easier with a stranger because, you got no skin in the game always. But sometimes it's harder to do it with yourself, to do it with your spouse, with your daughter, with your son, with your nephew, with your niece, with your grandchild, with somebody close to you. And this is not about being naive. The Rebbe was not a naive person. Trust me, he was a very, very realistic human being. He saw the world for what it is, but he also saw the world for what it can be, for its potential. There was a third word added in our vocabulary by the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Many more, but I'm going to conclude with this. And for me, this is, I'll share it through a very moving story, and it's so relevant to these days, what's happening now in America. It's a story about a black woman. Her name, many of you heard of her. She passed away, I think, in the year 2005, around then, 2004, 2005. Her name was Shirley Chisholm. You remember Shirley Chisholm? Outspoken, articulate, great black woman, fighter, advocate for the black community, civil rights champion, fiery, passionate orator and communicator. Many of you remember her, and in 1968, after years of fighting and advocacy, she finally was elected to the Congress. But sad to say, the U.S. House of Representatives was still controlled by some Southern racists. I don't have another word for them. And they decided to really obstruct Shirley Chisholm's path to success. So they appointed her on the Agricultural Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives. But her district was Brooklyn. She came from the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn, the neighborhood of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. There was a story in the New York Times, front page. Do any trees grow in Brooklyn? Appointing Shirley Chisholm as in charge of the Committee for Agriculture would be like you appointing me to take care of the cats in Jerusalem or the kangaroos in New Zealand. What does agriculture have to do with Brooklyn? Shirley Chisholm wanted to spend her life fighting poverty, enhancing education, uprooting racism, bigotry, prejudice. She was a civil rights champion. Agriculture in Brooklyn? But this was, I guess, their way of making sure that her influence doesn't go too far. She was not upset. She was furious. She was livid. Until one day, she gets a call from the office of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Nechama Schneerson. The Hasidic Lubavitcher Rabbi wants to see you. Now, she was once by him. She asked him if he can endorse her publicly and officially. The Rebbe would not do that. So that was her only meeting with him. But she came back a second time. She walks into the Rebbe's office, and with eyes full of compassion, he turns to her and he says, I understand that you're very upset. She says, upset? I am furious. And she shares with the Rebbe her disappointments. She was finally elected to the Congress. She wanted to seize the opportunity to be able to yield influence in a positive direction. And what did they do for her? Her position is now as chairman or leader in the Agricultural Committee. Very good. So she's going to take care of trees in Brooklyn, New York. Very important job. Go visit Brooklyn and you'll see about agriculture in Brooklyn. I grew up in Brooklyn. This is no farms in Brooklyn. It's hard to find. You'll find a tree, but not very popular. Here, I'm in Rockland County. There's trees everywhere, and there's deer all day we have deer hanging out and enjoying our trees. But Brooklyn is a very different neighborhood. The Rebbe says, you're upset. And she says, I'm furious. And the Rebbe says, I think God has given you an incredible gift. And you need to seize the moment. What gift? Where gift? The Rebbe said, I want to share something with you. The Agricultural Committee, that's amazing. You know why? Do you know that there is such a great surplus of food in the United States of America? A lot of extra food. They don't know what to do with it. And you know there are so many hungry children in America. Imagine you were given the gift of being the matchmaker between the excessive food and the hungry children. This is an incredible opportunity that you were given to make a difference in people's lives. Go and seize the gift that God Almighty has given you. She left the room, not knowing what to do with this interesting message of a Hasidic Rebbe in Brooklyn. But a few days later, she was in Washington. It was her first day in Washington, and she meets, at that time, somebody who was a very young congressman. Later, he would become very famous, Robert Dole. And Robert Dole, Kansas, starts lamenting to Shirley Chisholm about the crises of farmers in the Midwest who have so much crop and produce and don't know what to do with it. They're now purchasing, a lot of Americans are purchasing food. Companies are getting food from Cuba, and these farmers are left with huge quantities of produce, not knowing what to do with it, and a huge financial loss. Robert Dole is telling Shirley Chisholm, the black woman, and she's like, oh my God, that's what the Rebbe spoke about. And these two individuals created over the next few years what would become the incredible food stamps and WIC program, using all the surplus of food of the Midwestern farmers, which then continue to grow and expand. And today has millions and millions of people who benefit from this institution that Shirley Chisholm created back in 1968. And as she was leaving office, she told a story. And she said, I owe such profound gratitude to a rabbi who never, ever lost optimism. And even when faced with a moment that seemed so bleak and so challenging and so difficult, it was a real crisis. He taught me how to take the crisis and turn it into an opportunity, how to look at the world from an optimistic perspective, how to seize the moment and find the silver lining and use the opportunity that was given to me, even if it seemed so negative, as a springboard for tremendous growth. Because today, she said, and I quote, if there is a child, black or white, Hispanic or any other ethnic group, who does not go hungry, hungry children who are given milk and bread, who are given food to sustain them and give them the nutrients and the nurture they need, it's because of the vision of a rabbi in Crown Heights who understood what can be done when you take a crisis and you turn it into opportunity. This too became part of the vocabulary of the Jewish world, taught, exemplified, and embodied by the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And that is, you are never, ever a victim. The Rebbe did not recognize victims, and he did not recognize crises. Every victim, he changed the vocabulary. You're not a victim, you are an ambassador. Delete the word victim. I am not a victim. I am a divine ambassador sent by God into this situation. And I am not facing a crisis. I am facing an opportunity. And what is the opportunity? The opportunity is to bring more light into the world, more love into the world, more kindness into the world. Thank you very, very much. I think we'll take some questions now, right?
Rabbi Jacobson.
Yes.
I hope you can hear me. Thank you for that wonderful speech. There are a couple of questions which have come in, and in no particular order. I saw that the Rebbe said, and my rabbis have echoed this, that in Judaism, we should go step by step and take on as we move along in our trajectory. Is that a compromise, or is there true validity to each step?
Great question. I heard that the Rebbe encouraged people when they wanted to grow in their Judaism to take incremental steps, go step by step, and not take quantum leaps. Is that a compromise? Does that constitute a compromise? I heard the Rebbe himself discuss this, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe explained this numerous times, that this actually was not a compromise. It was the only effective way to be able to allow change to be integrated into a person's system. Very often, we wake up one morning and we say, I'm going to change my whole life. And you know what? There are moments in history when there is such a alarming situation, we change our lives. I mean, look at the coronavirus, right? Within a few days, everything shut down. Imagine if I would have told you on Hanukkah that in a few months, every single school and shul and business and industry would close down. You would tell me I'm a crazy person. I'm completely mad. But it happened. So sometimes there are quantum leaps that demand absolute radical changes. But generally in human life, the Rebbe stressed often that a person must grow in a way that is integrated. So just to transform my entire life and say goodbye to my entire past and embark on a future without a system that allows it to become integrated usually proves to be futile and ineffective, and sometimes could even have a negative impact, because a person wakes up one day and gets very annoyed and they don't recognize themselves. And that's why the Rebbe always stressed that when we teach a Jew Judaism, we never make a compromise in the Torah. We never say, you know what, Shabbos is not so important, or kosher is not a real mitzvah, or this holiday is not so vital, or this mitzvah you can do without it. We don't say that. The Torah is divine, and each mitzvah is indispensable to the divine symphony. But for me to be able to integrate it into my life, I have to be able to grow in a way that is successful, that is personalized, in a way that the ideas and the practices become integrated into my life, into my family's life, in a way that will not backfire and come to haunt me, but in a way that actually will add celebration and meaning for me and for the people around me.
Thank you. And just a note to all listening, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box on the side, and if time allows, we will address them to Rabbi Jacobson. You mentioned that the Rebbe was an introvert. Talking for many people who face, whether they're an introvert or other characteristics or inhibitions in their life to do good, what was the message? How did the Rebbe change that, and how can we take that into our own lives?
I love that question. I mentioned the Rebbe was an introvert, and yet he spoke for 42 years to thousands and thousands of people. He met hundreds and thousands of people, and he became one of the most public figures of the last generation in the Jewish world, and even to some degree in the non-Jewish world. How did that happen? It's a great question. I'll tell you something I heard from a friend of mine. I'm not sure it's true, but I'll tell it to you anyway because it fascinated me. There was a man, some of you knew him. His name was Meir Abessera. Meir Abessera was a French existentialist who became a Baal Tshuva. He was one of the biggest proponents of macrobiotics. You know macrobiotics? Some of you were into macrobiotics in the 60s and the 70s. Some of you are still into it. This was Meir Abessera. He wrote a book called The Possible Man. He was an interesting man. He became close to the Rebbe. I remember he became the whistler of 770. The Rebbe sometimes in the middle of a festive melody would turn around to Meir Abessera, who was a French radical, and stick both fingers into his mouth, and he should start whistling. And Meir would whistle and whistle and whistle. He was an extraordinary whistler. So I was once schmoozing with Meir Abessera. He died a few years ago. He was a special character. And he tells me, he says, he used to speak like this. You know, the Rebbe was very, very shy, very, very shy. I said, Meir, how would you know? And he said, did you realize, he tells me, did you realize, Rabbi Jacobson, whenever the Rebbe would sit down at a Fabrengen, he would sit down at a public address on his chair. The Rebbe had a red chair. He would come to the platform. He would sit down. There were big Fabrengens, Purim and Yutas Kislev and other holidays and great dates when the Rebbe would have these huge gatherings, thousands of people. He says, do you ever notice that before the Rebbe would start talking, he would move around in the chair, the right, to the left, in the middle, back and forth. It took him time to settle in the chair. Do you know why? I said, I noticed it always, but I never knew why. He says, because the Rebbe was so shy. It was not easy for him to start talking to so many people. There was something that was very challenging for him. And I'm like, wow, you may be right. And then there was a Jew, a rabbi in France. His name was Rabbi Pevsner, and he related that in 1969, the Rebbe told him that every time I have to speak publicly, it's an act that requires sacrifice. That's an incredible confession of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. I would have never guessed that on my own. But I think the truth is as follows, that the Rebbe ultimately, in the final equation, saw himself as an ambassador of God in this world and a conduit for God's will. And therefore, the moment the Rebbe articulated to himself that his mission is to become a leader, a Rebbe, a mentor, a father, a guide, a teacher, a Rebbe, succeeding his father-in-law as the seventh Lubavitcher Rebbe, that was a choice. And once he made that choice, there was no turning back. And the Rebbe completely became that person. And to be that person, he had to speak, he had to meet people, he had to communicate with people, he had to write, he had to give public addresses, and he really had to take on the culture of a generation and guide the ship and guide the airplane, as I discussed. And I think the Rebbe made that decision. It was probably not an easy decision. It was probably a very, very difficult decision, not only because of that, but because of other reasons as well. And I think that this only magnifies the extraordinary greatness of what the Rebbe did, which was something, I think, in many ways, contrary to his nature.
Another question which came in, I think is on everyone's mind, although it may be a little bit of a longer question. You may want to take it, there's a few parts to it perhaps, and you did address some of it. What do you think the Rebbe's advice would be in regards to the times we're living in regards to the virus, its challenges, as well as the racial tensions that seem to be pulling us apart at the same time?
You're asking a question that's above my pay grade. I cannot speak for the Rebbe and tell you what his advice would be. What I could share is ideas and insights that I had the privilege of hearing from the Rebbe over the years, that I think many of them can be applicable to at least some of the dilemmas of today. In response to your question, what would the Rebbe say about the coronavirus? And what would the Rebbe say about the racial tensions? And I'll discuss, I think, two major themes that the Rebbe addressed over the years that I think could be very relevant. Theme number one, in terms of the coronavirus, the Rebbe always stressed that every challenge that humanity faces is always an opportunity for unprecedented renewal and rebirth and transformation and growth. And I think it would be fair to say that at least part of the Rebbe's approach about the coronavirus is that we must utilize this pandemic to create an unprecedented rejuvenation, not only among the Jewish people, but among humanity. Because for months, people were quarantined at home. Every industry was impacted. Every sector was transformed. For months, people did not rely on the regular sources of entertainment, whether it's going to a club or going to a bar or going to a movie theater or going to a game or going to a mall or going to a stadium or going to another outlet of entertainment. And people really had to retreat into themselves. And I think the Rebbe would have taught us and teaches us that this is an unbelievable opportunity to create a spiritual revival in the human psyche and help people really take this time and re-prioritize their life, make shifts in their attitudes and in their lives that will last a lifetime and help bring our world closer to redemption. Which brings me to the second topic in terms of racial tension. The Rebbe, as a great staunch representative of Judaism and Jewish faith, would often quote the story of the Talmud, an incredible story. The Talmud in Tractate Tainus, page 20, tells a story that there was a rabbi, Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, who was riding on a donkey, going home, very happy mood, and he met a person who was very ugly. He thought he was very ugly. And he told this person, "You're so ugly. Where do you come from? Are all the people in your city so ugly?" And the man looked at him and said, "Leich le'uman sha'asa'ani v'haged loi kama mechur kli zeh sha'asisa." Go to the craftsman who made me and tell him that you really fashioned an ugly vessel. Which means go to God and tell God that you have really struck out on this one, because this man is so ugly, is so grotesque. And he says, "Forgive me." And he says, "I will not forgive you until you go to the craftsman who molded me and tell him what an ugly vessel you have designed." And this great sage apologized and then went to the synagogue and apologized in public, and the man ultimately forgave him. And the Rebbe would often use this Talmud and present an incredible teaching, and that is, whenever we put down or insult or denigrate, internally or externally, another human being because of features that God has given them, we're not insulting only the other person. We're insulting God himself. Every human being is designed in the image of God, and therefore every human being possesses absolute dignity. So the concept of a Jew, of the Rebbe, of any Jew, looking at another person, and as a result of the color of their skin, or their race, or their ethnic background, or the color of their eyes, or their family history, or any other component about themselves, to be able to cause that, to make us judge them differently and look at them in any way but as a child of God created in his image, the Rebbe felt is not only an insult against society or against a group of people, it's an insult against God. There's no way you could take God seriously and not see the dignity in every single human being, no matter who he or she is, no matter where they come from, no matter which persuasion, which race, which ethnic group, no matter the color of their skin or any other aspect about their life. Every human being carries within themselves the image and the trace of God, which means also that every human being has something that can inspire me, that can inspire us. And the Rebbe really believed this. In every human being, he believed in every person, there is something that can inspire you. You know why? Because there's a piece of God. They are the image of God. And if you are not inspired by them, then that means you are disconnected from who you really are. Because in every single person, there is something uniquely inspirational. So that was a very powerful message in the Rebbe's teachings. And an equally powerful message to conclude with is the other side. And that is the importance of education, of values. The Rebbe felt that giving people freedom and equality is amazing and incredible, but it must always be coupled with an education towards responsibility. Each of us has the unique responsibility to educate our children and our disciples with absolute moral values, that God cares about our lives, holds us responsible for our lives, that good and evil are absolute values, and that the greatest thing we need to educate our children with is the sensitivity to be able to be loving and kind to other people, and God forbid, not to harm another individual, even if there is a difficult mood, or there is rage, or there's trauma, or I have some type of instinct for evil. It never gives us the liberty to be able to defy the will of God, which is that we are kind towards each other. These are the messages that the Rebbe taught over the years that I think have the power to change and liberate our society from bigotry, from prejudice, from racism, from violence, from irresponsible behavior, etc.
Another question which came in the chat, and thank you so far for taking all of these.
My pleasure.
How can I implement the lesson of this lecture, the Rebbe's message, into my personal life? Whether I am living an Orthodox life at the moment or not, how do I implement the Rebbe's message, the vocabulary you mentioned, and make it part of who I am in my own circle, in my own life?
I love that question. Wow, I love that. That's a beautiful question. And the answer to that is, don't try to implement everything I said in your life. Because this is the work. This is the work of a lifetime. But I would say take one point and try to internalize it. And from tomorrow morning, and if you want from tonight, I won't sue you if you start tonight, make that a guiding light in your life. So for example, take our first point. Our first point was about our collective responsibility and love towards each other. Maybe every night before you go to sleep, ask yourself, is there one person I helped today? And if not, don't go to sleep. Send a text, write an email, make a telephone call. One person to help them. Maybe a relative, maybe a stranger. Reach out. Do a favor to somebody. Every day we should focus on how we can help at least one person during that day. And if I did not, I shouldn't go to sleep until I make sure to kindle hope in another person's heart. And every person can do this. There's one teenager who you can affect. There's one senior citizen who you can embrace. There's one person who's broken who you can give hope. And there's one human being whose heart you can kindle. Or number two, we spoke very much about how you look at yourself. Next time you're experiencing anxiety of anything in life, we all suffer from anxiety. Anxiety is the hot word. Everybody's anxious. Not everybody, most people. Anxiety. Next time you're experiencing anxiety, don't surrender to it. Welcome it. Say hi, anxiety, but don't define yourself by it. Remember that you are a piece of infinity, and therefore the anxiety is not your essence. Your essence is pure, infinite, invincible, happy godliness. That's what your essence is. The anxiety is coming to teach you about yourself so that you should be able to discover deeper resources and have more awareness. Don't see the anxiety as your destination. The anxiety is a teacher. Ask it, what do you want to tell me? There's something you're trying to tell me. Maybe I'm in denial. Maybe I'm repressing something. Maybe I'm not comfortable with something. Listen to what the anxiety is trying to teach you. But the anxiety is not your master. It's just a conduit for you to discover something, and always retain that ability to be able to view yourself as a piece of infinity. So these are some things that I think we can each internalize based on the message.
Would you share with us maybe your favorite personal moment or a personal story in all your years of interacting with the Rebbe? Something that will share a different side, perhaps, of the relationship.
That's a great question. If I could share a personal moving moment with the Rebbe. It was one Simchas Torah. I don't think I ever shared this story with anybody. It was one Simchas Torah. I was around 11 years old. And I had some struggles, some of my own struggles, even though I was 11 years old, a little kid. But, I had my own struggles. And I was in 770 in this main synagogue. I think it was Simchas Torah 1983. And there were, how many people were there? Rabbi Backman, you remember. The place legally is supposed to hold 2,000 people. There were maybe 9,000 or 10,000 people there. Completely illegal.
Absolutely.
Now, you'll think I'm exaggerating, but all my colleagues can testify. There were people hanging onto every beam, nook, cranny. If you would throw a needle, it would not land on the floor. Literally, it would not. The vapor the heat and the smoke that was rising was incredible. People were hanging from air conditions, from fans. I have seen people who needed a place, so they would just jump and they would not get down to the ground because it was too packed. So they were made suspended between people because they could not get down to the ground until finally somebody moved, a centimeter, and they fell down. It was so packed. It was surreal. Benjamin Netanyahu, once in the UN, if you remember, coming out of the UN, he described the scene because he used to come Simchas Torah to the Lubavitcher Rebbe when he served as the Israeli ambassador, the Israeli consul in New York. He would come for Simchas Torah. Anyway, I was a child, and I had my place. I was sitting, and I think it was before the sixth hakafa, before the sixth dance. And my father, the late YY Jacobson, he was a seasoned Jewish journalist. And he was given a Torah scroll to go dance around the bima like we do Simchas Torah. And whoever got a Torah scroll in the front would walk by the Rebbe to go to the dancing platform with the bima. It was a pretty long walk because the Rebbe was in the east in the front and the bima was closer to the west or somewhere mid-shul. As my father walked by the Rebbe, I saw that the Rebbe motioned to him to come closer to him. So he came closer to him. I was just watching from far. I couldn't obviously hear the conversation. I wasn't close enough. And they spoke. I don't know, the Rebbe spoke to him. I don't know if it was 5 seconds, maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute, a short conversation. And I'm watching, I'm looking, and then suddenly I see the Rebbe pointing to me like this. He went like this. He pointed his finger a few times. And then he went like this. He made this gesture that I should leave, I should go. What is he, throwing me out of shul? What did I do? Chabad doesn't throw anybody out of the synagogue. You ever saw a Chabad house throw somebody out of the shul? The Rebbe was going like this with his hand, like, go. I didn't know. I was blushing. I was sitting among a lot of kids. There were a lot of kids. And I was sitting probably among 40 kids, 50 kids, squashed, close to the front. So my father came by. He was going to the bima, and he motioned to me to get up and to come with him to dance. I didn't really want to go because I would lose my place. So I didn't want to go. I said, why should I go? He said, the Rebbe asked that you go dance. So obviously I got up and I went to dance with my father. And I was hesitating. Do I go? Do I not go? And I was walking backwards because I didn't want to turn my back to the Rebbe out of respect. And with his hand, he motioned like, just turn around and go, which is what I did. Later, when we came home, my father told me that when he went by the Rebbe with the Torah scroll, the Rebbe said, take your son to dance with you. So my father said, this is what he told me. My father said, Vel chizun, I have 2 brothers. So that my father had 3 sons, has 3 sons. Sivan is my oldest brother. Many of you read his book, Towards a Meaningful Life, Simon Jacobson. I have an older brother named Baruch, Rabbi Baruch Jacobson, Chabad of Hunter College. And then I'm the baby of the family. We also have 2 sisters, Chani and Fraida. So my father, typical, my father says, Vel chizun, which son? Which son? You say, take my son, which son? So he said, the Rebbe, he tells my father, says, that's why the Rebbe was pointing to you to tell me to take this son and to go dance. I don't know why the Rebbe told my father to take me to dance. I don't know. I remember the story from then, that the Rebbe motioned me to go. But as I thought about it, when you asked me this question, I was thinking for a moment, and I thought there were maybe 10,000 people in the room. 10,000 people in the room, literally. And incredible. And I was a little kid, 11 years old. But I had my struggles. And maybe the Rebbe felt something. I still don't know. But it was incredible that from all the people, the Rebbe asked my father, and he pointed to me, and he really wanted I should go dance. And for me, it really represents a deep empowerment that the Rebbe was telling me that no matter what you're going through, and notwithstanding any internal struggles, don't stop dancing, and you will triumph, because light prevails over darkness. And I want to share something with you as well. Yesterday was my birthday. The 29th day of Sivan was my birthday. You could send the birthday cake afterwards through Zoom, and I will eat it through Zoom, so that way I won't gain any more weight. because I'm on a diet, or I should be on a diet. So I'll eat all the birthday cakes through Zoom, or you could send a macrobiotic birthday cake. So for the first time since quarantine, I went to visit the Ohel, the resting place of the Lubavitcher Rebbe in Queens. I live in Monsey. It's an hour drive. But due to the pandemic, we didn't go anywhere. No shul, no school, no work, no lectures. I didn't travel anywhere. I'm home here. And but for my birthday, I took a mask. And because the restrictions are easy, the restrictions have weakened. So I went to visit the resting place of the Rebbe in honor of my birthday. I went with my wife and two of my boys. And it's very different over there. They used to have, tents with hot water, and people would eat sandwiches and coffee and tea and schmooze. Now there's only a few chairs, not a lot of hanging out, social distancing. They conform to the laws of New York. And I wrote a long letter before. I wasn't there for many months. Obviously, last time I was there was Purim. I was there Purim morning, like 6 o'clock in the morning. I was there on Purim. But since Purim, how many months is it? Ydalet Sivan, Ydalet Nisan, Iyar Sivan, almost 4 months, 3.5 months, almost 4 months. But for my birthday, I wanted to go, and also this week is the Rebbe's yahrzeit on Thursday. So I felt compelled to, and I wrote a long letter, and I prayed there for a while, for a long time. And after that, I came out, and I went to the grave of my father. My father, who died 15 years ago, is also buried there a little further in the cemetery, Montefiore Cemetery in Queens. So I went with my wife and my 2 sons to my father's grave, and we prayed over there. And I asked my father to pray on our behalf to God for our family needs. It was also always an emotional experience. And then we left the cemetery, and I went, they have it by the Rebbe's gravesite. There's the little, if you're ever there, there's a tent and there's a house where you could wash your hands. You could go out for your needs. They sell some books. It's a little place, a little hub to get a coffee. So I went there, and there's a video of the Rebbe that plays over there. So I go into I just came out for the cemetery. I went there. My kids wanted to get a book, so I was waiting there for a few minutes. And the Rebbe was finishing a fabrengen. He was finishing a gathering. At the end of a fabrengen, the Rebbe would give dollars, but not to everybody because there were so many people. He would give dollars to the tankisten. You know what tankisten are? Tankisten are young men or boys who would go on mitzvah tanks in the streets of New York and elsewhere and try to do mitzvahs with Jews. They would go with music and give Hanukkah menorahs or Shabbos candles or wrap tefillin on Jews or give lulav to Jews. Many, many Jews have began their journey back to Judaism through Chabad or through other organizations from those interesting encounters in the streets with Chabad youth. These were called the tankisten. So the Rebbe would give each of them a package, a pile of dollars, $50 or $100 or $20, and they would distribute it to anyone in the shul there to give to charity. The Rebbe wanted everybody should give $1 for charity. So I also went. Anyway, I'm come back from the cemetery. I go into the house, and it's a video of the Rebbe giving these tankisten. And I'm watching, and suddenly I appear in the video. I appear in the video, the age that I described to you. I was a little kid a few years before my bar mitzvah. And I walked by, and the Rebbe wanted to know, usually the Rebbe would just give. I guess I was very young and small, so he asked me if I'm a tankist, which means if I'm part of this mission of going out and doing mitzvahs with Jews. So I said, yeah, and he gave me the pile of dollars to give. And my wife turns to me and says, mathematically, what are the chances that right when you come out of the resting place of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, where you asked for a lot of things, your face will show up on the video, and the Rebbe will ask you, are you part of this mission? And you would say yes, and he would give you the dollars. So that was really an incredible moment that happened yesterday, Sunday afternoon. And it really represented to me that the power and the connection to what tzaddik is not only physical, it's eternal, it's spiritual, because a soul never dies. And the connection to what tzaddik, like the Rebbe, remains very real, it remains very profound, that years after his passing, there's still the inspiration and the wisdom and the truth that he teaches. And in my own case, for me, it was not only a display of blessings and saying, I remember you and I'm going to pray to God for you, but also the question, make sure that you never, ever forget who you are and the powerful mission that you have to be able to bring light to the world.
Rabbi Raichik, we don't hear you.
Yeah, I'm here. Got it. Okay, we're gonna leave it with that. I think we greatly enjoyed it. Greatly enjoyed the.
I love you all. Thank you, Rabbi Raichik. Thank you to all the rabbis and rebbitzins. Thank you for all of you, to all of you who have joined us for such a beautiful and incredible evening.
This class is brought to you by theyeshiva.net. Please help us continue the classes. Make even a small contribution at www.theyeshiva.net/donate.